All right, guys, getting back into the shading. Did a couple quick things while the camera was off, and you may notice that the big thing that I started to do is bridge the gap between the deep shadows and the lighter tones. So kind of fading these shadows just a little darker, especially on this graphite one, and kind of bridging the gap between the light and the shadow, just a slower fade. So the thing about rounded objects is as the light curves across an object, it's going to be a slow fade. Now this feels really abrupt when it goes dark, but from this point, from point A to B, we're gradually getting darker, 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 really dark across that rounded form. Versus something like a cube, in which is very abrupt, right? From the light side to the shadow side, because there's a ridge there. So keep that in mind when you go to shade. The thing that's going to make these rounded forms feel accurately rounded in space and believable is that slow, gradual kind of gradient fade. So I'll go back to the graphite drawing. I've got my HB and 3B pencil for starters. And what you might consider doing, graphite can be a tough one to build up because it takes quite a bit longer. You'll notice the darks here are not as dark as on the charcoal, and I've barely done any work there yet. So I'm going with the 3B first. And I know the darkest spot in this drawing in any spherical shape is going to be just below the sphere where it touches a tabletop or the floor or whatever we're working with. So I'm going to go ahead and push quite a bit harder on that pencil, maybe bear down on it a good bit more than I had been doing, right up to the edge of that spherical shape. So trying to make kind of a hard line, and you'll notice right away that our eye kind of goes right here first and foremost. So I'm really doubling up on this shadow. It felt dark before, but now it's quite a bit noticeably darker here already. And I can still go even darker. So that's the thing about a pencil like a 3B here. I don't necessarily have to jump up to an 8B or a 6B to get darker. It's all about how much pressure I'm putting on the pencil. So I'm going to fade it gradually. I'm easing up on the pressure, and you notice that it kind of fades away to the right side of that shadow. But immediately, once I put this kind of deep darkness underneath the tone or the shape of the sphere, I have room to start to grow the shadow shape on the sphere itself. So I don't want this shadow to be as dark as this, but right now there's 5 steps of value between these two. So I'm going to take a little bit of this 3B and across the shadow's core, so the deepest part of the shadow within the sphere, I'm going to, again, put a little bit of heavier pressure on here. Still using the wide side of the pencil, but bearing down quite a bit more, building up a deepest, darkest shadow on the sphere. Now, how dark we go would depend on how dark the actual color of the sphere was. So if this was a white ball versus an orange basketball versus a gray ball, would totally depend on how dark we should go with it. But if you notice, it's starting to feel a little bit more rounded already because I'm incrementally increasing the amount of darkness here. Okay, you'll see there's quite a bit of the tooth of the paper shining through, that texture. I'm just going to embrace that for right now. There are ways to get rid of it, but for now, we're just going to go with it. A little bit of a looser render here. So the deepest part of that shadow should be right through this area where I'm working. And notice I'm working in as big of an area as I can. I'm not trying to limit myself to one small space. So deepened up the cast shadow, now the shadow's core across the actual form. Now I'm going to lightly take this 3B pencil and I'm going to shade over some of the reflected light. The trick with reflected light is we need this to feel much lighter than the core shadow and especially lighter than the cast shadow, but we don't want it to feel as bright as the light area. Think of the light as coming in and hitting that sphere directly. This is reflected, so it's indirect light on the backside, and most of us tend to want to over-exaggerate just how bright that reflected light is going to feel. So I can see it, but I don't want it to be distracting. And another way you can make that reflected light feel even brighter, and I'll show you this in just a second, is to darken the cast shadow underneath. So far this is all the 3B in those deeper shadow tones. So notice this reflected light should start to pop even more than I had it before because I'm using more of the point of this pencil, and I'm really starting to aggressively dig in with the 3B, getting closer to the darkest darks, the blackest blacks I can achieve with the graphite. Getting closer, maybe not quite there yet. All right, so that is starting to come together. Okay, so I have a lot of work to build up into the light. I built more of the shadow area right now. For that, I think I would probably try to use the HB pencil with a light touch. So what I'm going to try to do now is kind of bridge the general light into a little bit of general shadow and then into the core shadow. So the HB I'm going to build up kind of boldest right here against the core shadow. So the goal would be that there are slight changes from dark over here to light, but it feels very gradual. And then I'm just easing up the pressure as I work my way closer to the light and especially toward the highlight. Maybe at this point we would transition into a 2H pencil, getting closer to that highlight. And the 2H is a harder lead, so I have to be careful not to show my strokes or marks. All right, so getting what feels like a pretty decent light source coming in here, and nice clean kind of gradients and fades. Things feel a little more knitted together on this side compared to this one, right? There's still kind of some harsh jumps from dark to mid to light. So we'll try to do a similar type of a thing over here. So I'm gonna put down the graphite. And let's dive into the charcoal. So I'm gonna start here in a similar way by diving in with darker charcoal pencil. So this is a 4H, which is pretty kind of medium soft. And let's start in the same way. I'm gonna go into a cast shadow, which I know should be one of the darker moments. Now it's much easier to go very rich, kind of a black dark with the charcoal than it would be with the graphite. So I barely have to press with this kind of softer charcoal and check out just how dark we can get. I was using a bit more of the point of the charcoal here, especially right up under the, right along this edge, so it really stands out and pops out. One downside to working flat like I am right now is that the charcoal dust just sits on the paper. A benefit of working on an easel like you guys might be is that dust is gonna fall down off your page. And just to show you just how dark I could get if I wanted to, I'm gonna really bear down on this pencil just to show you what a closer to a true black would look like. So starting to get excessively dark here in a good way. And now it shows me how much work I still need to do on the sphere itself, which is a good thing. So now if I'm that dark here, I wanna get the core of my shadow on the actual form of the sphere a good bit darker, especially right through here. Right now using my finger, which I generally don't necessarily suggest that you all do, but just very quickly to kind of press a little bit of that charcoal into the tooth of the page, because sometimes that tooth can be a little distracting with the charcoal. Notice it just kind of settles in a little bit better there. All right. And now you'll notice it feels like a nice rich shadow here. I'm gonna have to do a lot of work to fade and blend it in this direction. but here way too light in comparison to our reflected light here. So what I want to do is, yes, I want this reflected light to seem a bit lighter than the rest of the core of the shadow. Definitely I want it to feel lighter than the cast shadow on the ground, but again, don't want it to be excessive or distracting. Keep in mind that sometimes if you do what I just did and kind of go outside the lines a little bit, the kneaded eraser is a great way to come back and kind of reshape your object a little, kind of tidy things up a little along the way. And in a similar way, if you feel like you maybe lost a little of your reflected light and you need to bring some of it back, the kneaded eraser is a great way to just remove a little bit of material occasionally. So now you can see where it lightens up along here. We may have to bring that out later, but good enough for now. Darkest here. Now I need to work into some of the mids in a similar way to how I'm starting to over here. For this, I'm going to go for a harder charcoal, just because, again, charcoal tends to go so dark so quickly. I want to get a softer, slower fade out of this. All right, now I've been doing this a long time, so I have a pretty good control over the pencil. So I kind of trust my hand and my pressure sensitivity. This is something that you guys will have to work on, because what we don't want is this sort of thing where you see a lot of choppy brush strokes or marks. I call them brush strokes because I'm used to painting a lot too, but synonymous, same sort of thing is what I mean, just the stroke of the pencil. Now again, you can use a blending tool. I'm using my finger, which is a bit of a no-no, just so you guys know, mostly because the oils of your hands are getting embedded into the paper, which isn't always great. Some sort of a blending tool like a chamois can be really nice. Again, we talked about blending stumps. I'm not a super fan of it, but what tends to happen is things get a little bit maybe loosey-goosey. If you notice, it looks like I just put a divot in that sphere right here. It can be used as a bit of a crutch, and it doesn't force you to have that control over the tool, the pencil, or the actual charcoal stick that blending just with the tool itself does. So as much as we can, we want to do the work with the pencil, with the charcoal stick, at least in the beginning here. Right. Just doing a little bit of reshaping along the edge here, guys. It was looking a little bit funky over there. Okay, so once you get it to this level, I would say these are getting into a more closer to a realistic version of these spheres, much closer than we have been previously. But we could really spend a lot of time on these. So I'm going to keep working on mine. I'll have the actual originals to show you in person along with this video, so you can kind of get a sense of where I take it to. But see just how smooth we can make these transitions, and can we get, in the end, the most important thing would be, can we achieve a highlight area? So just like we see here, the lightest light, general light, slipping into shadow, shadow's core through here where it gets the absolute darkest, a little bit of reflected light where it lightens up toward the base of the sphere, and then the cast shadow, which is going to be the darkest area. And hopefully we can see the same thing on the graphite. So that's the general breakdown of a sphere. It's not always going to look like this. Obviously the light source can change, but hopefully this is a good kind of starter for you when it comes to shading spherical objects.